story of Don Quixote of La Mancha was originally published as two books by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra in 1605 and 1615. The early editions of the tale were illustrated anonymously and reproduced as relatively unsophisticated woodcuts. This was the infancy of printed narrative illustration, and many of the visual devices and principles we now take for granted had yet to be developed. And it's this woven tapestry from a series made in London in 1675 which represents arguably the most compelling and entertaining early visualization of the story. In the 18th century there were clear signs of increased sensitivity in the use of illustration, and in 1725 an edition was published in London featuring the work of French artist Charles-Antoine Coypel and engraved by James Mind. Coypel was also responsible for creating the drawings which were used as the basis of another series of tapestries produced a few years later by the Jacques Nielsen workshop in Paris. Printed colour was still a distant dream, but artists such as John Vanderbank, who painted several scenes from the story, also used the wood engraving process to produce a series of lively printed monochromes in 1742. British artist and printmaker William Hogarth created a set of 6 etchings of scenes from the Don Quixote narrative in 1756, which were sold as limited editions to collectors, some of which were coloured by hand for those wealthy enough to afford them. And Antonio Carniquero published a Spanish edition of engravings in 1780, which were exceptionally fine demonstrations of the skillful handling of the engraving process. In the first half of the 19th century, stone lithography was invented, but many illustrators, including the satirical cartoonist George Cruikshank, stuck with engraving for his 1837 humorous edition. Lithography was more widespread in France at this time, and Celestine Nanteuil used the method to create an edition published in 1855. Like John Vanderbank, French artist Gustave Doré also painted scenes from the book. But in 1863 he also produced what is generally considered to be the ultimate and arguably most enduring dramatic illustrated visualization of Don Quixote. But however remarkable Doré's undoubted visual prowess was, these timeless illustrations also owed an immense debt to the engraver Heliodore Pizan, whose technical skill converted Doré's more gestural pen and ink drawings into astonishingly detailed woodcuts. Similarly, the 1866 edition, based on the more comical drawings of Arthur Boyd Houghton, was engraved by the DL brothers, whose talent for graphic transcription was easily the most sought after in Victorian London. In 1879, the Catalan illustrator Apelles Mestre created what may well be the earliest colour edition of the story. And given that full-colour lithography wouldn't be possible for another 20 years, this highly imaginative visualization must have been created by the more demanding chromolithographic process. 2 decades later, in 1897, William Heath Robinson, who was among the earliest to take advantage of monochrome photolithography, published the first of 2 editions, with a series of expressive, more minimalist pen and ink drawings. And a year later, the more traditionally inclined Walter Crane published his version, which, although printed in colour, was created to evoke the woodcut techniques of earlier times. British comic artist Tom Brown first published his knockabout comic strip, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, in the same year, and it ran successfully for several decades, drawn by others when Brown died in 1910. Heath Robinson's second edition of Don Quixote was published in 1902, and as well as the expressive line drawing he'd made his reputation with, there were also several particularly engaging colour pages created in ink and watercolour, one of the earliest to be printed using full-colour offset lithography. And the comedic potential of the story was also well to the fore in a series of crudely printed comic postcards created in 1905 by Spanish cartoonist Pedro de Rojas. And this series brought the characters into comical collision with 20th century inventions. By this time, full-colour printing was fairly widespread in illustrated books, and many, such as the now forgotten British illustrator Stephen Bagot de la Barre, took advantage of this with a series of light comic watercolours in the same year. 1912 saw the publication of a French edition, which featured some highly distinctive desaturated colour illustrations by the equally forgotten Thomas Derrick. During the years of the Great War, book publication reduced dramatically, and the only significant edition I found from the time is a series of dark and dramatic expressionist woodcuts by German Walter Klemm in 1914. In the years following the war, new versions were few and far between, although British illustrator Gordon Brown published a very traditional-looking, but nevertheless visually engaging, series of pen drawings in 1921. The extent to which 20th century illustration had become stylistically diverse was clearly demonstrated only 4 years later, in 1926, by the French cartoonist Gus Beaufort. His edition contained a series of highly distinctive comic line and wash illustrations, which pushed the possibilities of humorous abstraction to its very limits. And only 2 years later, in 1930, veteran French illustrator Félix Loriot also published a particularly attractive comical series of watercolours for a children's edition of the tale. But the Modernists were definitely on the rise by now, and as if to underline this point, in 1930, American expatriate Edward McKnight Kauffer, usually known for his fragmented Modernist posters, released an altogether more challenging edition, a long way distant from conventional representation. Not quite as extreme and far more humorous, Piero Bernardini's 1935 Italian version nevertheless also featured angular Modernist images, some of which were created in attractive subdued colour, and monochromes which were about as minimal and geometric as could be imagined. A year later, Japanese artist and illustrator Serizawa Keisuke created a visually engrossing but to Western eyes hard to follow woodblock print version, which translated Don Quixote into an aging samurai in 17th century Japan. In 1939, in Germany, a collection of comical cigarette cards combining painterly techniques with cartoon anatomy was published by the obscure comic artist Stefan Martin. But that was also the year the war began. And as in the previous conflict, the publication of frivolous fiction was conspicuous by its absence. Although in the USA in 1941, German immigrant Hans Müller published an expressive and imaginative reading of the tale, with woodcuts using limited, well-chosen colour palettes. When the war ended in 1945, French illustrator Jacques Touchet published a particularly atmospheric ink and watercolour edition, which nicely blended comic art stylings with more representational techniques. And in the following year, two wildly different interpretations demonstrating the enduring appeal of the story were published. In America, a condensed comic book version was created by the obviously talented but obscure Louis Zansky. And at the other end of the cultural spectrum, the artist Salvador Dali produced a typically disturbing series of surreal lithographs and etchings. In 1950, French illustrator Eddy Legrand created one of the most compelling and personal interpretations for a limited edition published by Heritage Press. His spidery line work was highly descriptive, and the application of drab but tasteful colour combined to produce a highly compelling visualisation of the story. And in 1954, Italian illustrator Antonio Traverso created another particularly memorable interpretation with a series of dynamically composed and distinctively styled watercolours. 1966 was the 350th anniversary of Cervantes' death, and to honour his memory, a lavish limited edition was published featuring the paintings of seminal Spanish fantasy artist José Sigüenza, who, although 80 years old at the time, had evidently lost none of his talent for dramatically lit narrative illustration. In 1968, his compatriot Roque Riera Rojas produced an engrossing illustrated edition with a series of expressionistic but comedic compositions. These images successfully combine an angular drawn style with a wide range of painterly techniques and textures. And Russian illustrator and artist Sacha Brodsky also published a similarly personal and remarkably angular series of bleak but stylish monochromes in 1976. In 1999, the last edition of the 20th century was published. Retold by Michael Harrison, it featured a series of extremely well-observed pen and watercolour renders by the revered historical illustrator Victor Ambros. His images were a perfect blend of traditional draftsmanship and expressive execution. 2005 was the 400th anniversary of the first publication of Don Quixote, and in its honour the Mexican artist known as Eco published a commemorative series of 20 highly imaginative surreal woodcuts. And as if to underline the diversity of contemporary illustration, children's illustrator Quentin Blake created his own amusing limited edition version in the same year. In 2010, Chris Riddle created a finely inked and highly plausible series for a retelling by Martin Jenkins. And although manifestly comedic, his pen and watercolour illustrations were exceptionally well observed and drawn. And only a year later, American Tom Lathrop's retitled Misadventures of Don Quixote was published, with pen and wash illustrations by Mad Magazine's comic artist Jack Davis, whose prowess was obviously undiminished even at the age of 86. Also in 2011, Rob Davis published his globally popular 2-volume graphic novelisation of the story, featuring many dynamic pages using particularly well-chosen colour palettes. And to draw this video to its conclusion, here are two remarkably dissimilar interpretations from 2018. In that year, Venezuelan Roberto Weil produced an agreeably offbeat and distinctive version using a comic strip format. And Spanish digital illustrator Daniel Belchi Lorente created a more traditionally representational but highly atmospheric series for an edition in China. So it seems that 400 years after its first publication, Cervantes' mock heroic fantasy continues to resonate with more generations of illustrators eager to create their own visualizations. And I for one very much hope it continues to do so.